One of the important things that a conceptual framework should do is align with other phases of the design. So much like we talked about with Maxwell's research design map, and you'll note that conceptual frameworks are one of the 5 major portions of his research design, is that all of the parts of the research design should be integrated and interactive. And that's certainly what we're hoping for from any conceptual framework. The phases of design should merge with the problem, methods, findings, discussion, and, importantly, the rhetoric of the piece generally. Now, I'll go through in a moment and talk about how my conceptual framework that I just read to you a minute ago merges with the other aspects of design for this study. So for instance, the problem that I was interested in writing this article was that worldwide countries are trying to get more male teachers, but that goal has proved very elusive. Education as a field needs to understand what's keeping men away in terms of any kind of social, financial, political kinds of interactions. And we need to be looking at teacher training as a key but under-researched site. We can't just look at what happens once people get into the classroom. We need to look at all aspects of the teacher education stream. Now, when I look at my conceptual framework, several of the tenets there are represented in this problem statement. One of which is that some men are disadvantaged by gender, and some of those men happen to be male teachers. Now, when we look at education as a field, we need to be searching for types, times, and locations, and that's certainly part of my conceptual framework. That last paragraph, the conceptual framework, talks about looking at types, times, and locations, and to a certain extent that comes from a social interactionist perspective, because if there truly is something going on in terms of social interactionism, then we would be thinking about times and locations for those interactions. One of which, of course, is teacher training. And thinking about disadvantage as male teachers being kept away from teaching. So in addition to the problem, parts of the conceptual framework should be seen in the methods. Now, for this particular article, I talked to 3 male pre-service teachers, each of whom was at a different stage in their teacher education program, and each of whom was in different teaching roles, either in elementary, early, late elementary, or high school. One of my purposes was in exploring telling cases rather than typical cases. So I wasn't looking to generalize necessarily, but I was looking for instances that could really open up, theoretically, our understanding of how men are discouraged from teaching. One of my methodological paradigms was using intensive micro-level discourse analysis. And for each male pre-service teacher, I was looking at 2 semi-structured interviews and an observation for each one. Now, one of the pre-service teachers only conducted one of the interviews. He dropped out of the study because he was having some issues and difficulties with his teaching role. But because I used a symbolic interactionist framework, and particularly using micro-level discourse analysis, there's actually a lot of data in one interview, so I felt like I could keep it in there. But as we look at how the conceptual framework merges with these methods, if I'm looking at some men being disadvantaged by gender, I want to look specifically at male pre-service teachers. And because I'm looking for types, times, and locations, I want to look at males who are doing different things, seeing if there are other aspects of the experience that are driving this beyond just gender. That's true of looking for telling cases as well, because these telling cases, even if they aren't generalizable, still say something important about the types, times, and locations that these kinds of discouragement might happen. Symbolic interactionism does a really great job using discourse analysis quite often, so those methods are actually quite well aligned. Also, looking at observations and talking to people fits well with a symbolic interactionist framework, because symbolic interactionism looks at how the interaction between people creates social distance, power dynamics, and so on. When we look then at the rhetoric of the piece, how it's written and constructed, in each section in the findings, I outline an incident of discouragement that's common to at least two of the three pre-service teachers. I highlighted the thrust of the discouragement, explicated the strategies used by the men to resist the discouragement, and then suggest implications. Now you'll see when I'm setting out that rhetoric at the beginning of the findings, I'm talking about Butler's theory of performativity, so again, connecting that conceptual framework right to the way that I'm writing about it. I talk about these as incidents of discouragement, once again aligning this notion of looking for types, times, and locations. And I'm looking at strategies used so that these types, times, and locations are also connected to those particular strategies. This notion of strategies also aligns very well with symbolic interactionism. Again, it's how people go about interacting that creates power dynamics, and one of those ways of interacting is using particular gendered strategies. I want to talk about an example from the findings. So this is one small sample that shows you where that conceptual framework not only makes its way into the rhetoric and organization of the sections, but also in how I talk about the findings. Stanley. Stanley spoke about the fears that male teachers and their sexuality provoke in parents and even other caregivers. I think, definitely heard even professionally that there's a bias almost still against males just for almost social paranoia reasons, I mean, people sometimes are freaked out by the idea of males, spending lots of time around 4 and 5-year-olds, and stuff like that. It's definitely a gender factor that's influenced my, decision. The decision Stanley referred to here was his quitting training for kindergarten or first grade in favor of 4th and 5th grades. Social paranoia, meaning perceptions that a male teacher must have ulterior sexual motives in wanting to teach, partly deterred Stanley from pursuing the career he truly wanted. He had to, instead, find ways to prevent others, his audience, from being freaked out. By giving up on teaching younger children, he performed for everyone that he really does not have sexual intentions toward children. The price to prove his sexuality, giving up his intended career, was high indeed. So, as I showed you earlier, the way of talking about this conforms very well to the theoretical framework based on Butler's 1993 work. First, I point out a regulatory frame, that is, the frame that male sexuality is dangerous to young children. And I talk about how Stanley satisfies or resists this notion. You can see his resistance in the way he terms certain aspects of the general public's thoughts on the matter. He calls it social paranoia, or being freaked out, clearly showing that he resists this notion. There's also a performance. In this case, the performance is giving up teaching younger children. And then finally, there's a sanction or reward. And in this case, the reward was not being suspect anymore after he gave up teaching young children. So in the way that these paragraphs are constructed, you can see step by step that I've gone through Butler's framework, but also the way that I talk about these as performance and about rewards and about regulatory frames all leads back to that conceptual framework that I started with. Now, it's important to remember when we look at a conceptual framework like this in a published article that it didn't arrive fully formed. I didn't just simply take it from a book or have a pre-made model that was ready for me. Instead, over time, that conceptual framework is constructed and evolves, and that certainly is the case for my particular conceptual framework that you saw there. For all of you, even if you don't have a conceptual framework right now, perhaps you're at the beginning of a study and you haven't quite got it all together yet, just be patient, keep reading, keep thinking about the topic at hand, and that conceptual framework will form over time, and you'll learn about more and more theories that can contribute to your understanding of what's going on in the social situation that you're studying. But it's important to remember, again, a conceptual framework doesn't arrive fully formed. It's constructed and evolves. That message in itself hopefully will give you patience as you move forward in constructing a conceptual framework.